we need the Electoral College.
No, we don't. Electoral College is to be the most outdated and illogical thing that we keep using just because.
You've already included a logical fallacy right into the beginning of your presentation. To say that's why we are still using the Electoral College is an appeal from inertia. I'm not going to waste your time. Just read it. The Electoral College was and still is a compromise between the tyranny of the majority and the tyranny of the minority. And both parties are unhappy. That's why it's called a compromise. Now, your assertion is that we should destroy it to make things better, but that's more of a GOP kind of thing. The Electoral College isn't perfect, just like our Constitution. And what can we do with both? We can amend it, like we have done in the past. We'll get into that later. Built into the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, and it was modified under the 12th Amendment for a very good reason.
Slavery.
Incorrect, and I'm surprised you didn't say anything about the 12th Amendment, which was the amendment of the Electoral College. Before the 12th Amendment, things were very different with how presidents were elected, due to the Electoral College and a few other factors. In 1796, when John Adams won against Thomas Jefferson had to become his vice president. The electoral votes at the time didn't distinguish between who would be president and who would be vice president, which ended up in disaster in the election of 1800, when, although Thomas Jefferson won as president against John Adams, he tied in the electoral vote with his own vice president, Aaron Burr. Yeah, that's the guy who shot Alexander Hamilton. And yeah, it was the election of 1800 is the reason why he did it. Because Jefferson and Burr were both tied in electoral votes, it was left to the House of Representatives to decide who would become the president, and even though Burr did have more popularity, Alexander Hamilton convinced more reps to support Jefferson, even though he hated Jefferson, but he thought he was more trustworthy. And the entire ordeal was just bitter and contentious, so Congress had to do something about it. To make sure this never happened again, they put out the 12th Amendment in 1804. The electoral system has been amended, and it can be again. James Madison suggested a reform for the Electoral College in 1823 in his letter to George Hay. Read the gist of it here, or you should just Google it, and it's the common sense reform that we're talking about today with the Electoral College, where it's no longer a winner-take-all for the state's electoral votes. The electoral system would allow victories for the presidential candidates to go to state districts instead of the entirety of the state. Kind of like what Nebraska and Maine are doing. Unfortunately, Madison's idea never went through Congress. Now let's jump into your slavery argument.
James Madison, the father of the Constitution, observed on June 30th, 1787, the states were divided into different interests not by their difference of size, but by other circumstances, most material of which resulted partly from climate, but principally from their having or not having slaves. What pro-slavery advocates feared the most was democracy itself.
You did not distinguish between the James Madison quote and then the opinion of the author of this book. I shouldn't have to explain to you why that's wrong. You also didn't let anybody know what book you were reading from. It's the 1619 Project, nor did you mention the chapter titled Capitalism, which was written by Matthew Desmond, a sociologist. Quoting Desmond as if he knew exactly why the Electoral College was chosen is a fallacious appeal to authority. I could bring up my own authorities like Sean Willans, who's a professor of history at Princeton, who says that slavery was not the main topic as to why the Electoral College was chosen, and I will get into him later. Or Stanford professor of political science, John Rakow, who's also a Pulitzer Prize winner, who agrees with Willans. Robert Dahl as well, a sterling professor of political science at Yale. He's no longer with us.
This is not the only reason, but a large factor into why the Electoral College exists at all is because slaveholding states refused to ratify the Constitution unless they could guarantee that they would never be able to vote out slavery.
For most of your dialogue in the beginning, you kept mentioning slaveholding states. Let's open that up. The Constitution was ratified in 1789. The states in red are slaveholding states. The blue states are free. And there you go. You have New York, which was a slaveholding state, along with New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. You need to specify what you mean by slaveholding states, because the world was a completely different place in 1789. Maybe you meant to say southern states. Maybe you meant to say states that relied on slavery for their economy, but you can't just say slaveholding states because you destroy your entire argument. And everything you said about slaveholding states wanting a guarantee that slavery would never be abolished is also just your opinion along with Desmond's, which is mistaken as just shown in my previous illustration of the slaveholding map. But let's go back to historian Dillence's view with some facts as to why the Electoral College was chosen. Now I'm quoting from one of his articles. The electoral system still had some formidable foes. cheaply in the three most ardently pro-slavery states, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Because before the Electoral College system was introduced, there were two other options. One was the popular vote for president, and the second was a congressional vote. That's the system that these three states wanted. The electoral system promised to offer them additional votes for president above and beyond what their favored congressional system did. They scorned the electoral system on elitist grounds, charging that the independent electors, unlike congressmen, as Hugh Williamson put it, would not be the most respectable citizens, but men of inferior rank, open to bribery and other forms of corruption. Which is BS. Congressmen are just easier to manipulate, that's why. And what was the reason for not allowing the popular vote to determine who the president was? Well, having the people at large choose the president would be like referring a trial of colors to a blind man. This was widely accepted, which is why the Constitutional Convention defeated a motion for direct election by 9 states to 1. The gist of their reasoning is that the masses don't understand enough about the world, enough about politics, enough about anything really, to make the right decision for who gets to be the president. I'm sure some people feel that way. Either way, the point I'm trying to make here is that the electoral system was not the better option for slavery. It was actually the congressional selection, and that was dumped. Think about it. If Congress had the power to also elect the president, it gives the legislative branch way too much power over the executive, so it's better to have a separation of powers. The last detail regarding why we should abolish the Electoral College because of its origins is entirely irrelevant. If you think the Electoral College system is bad just because it helped uphold slavery, then you would feel the same way about the Fifth Amendment, which allows us right to whatever our property is. And unfortunately, at the time, slaves were considered property. The 10th Amendment as well, which pretty much says whatever is written for the federal government is theirs, but the rest belongs to states. And guess what? Slavery was considered a states' rights matter. I don't know about you, but I like the Fifth Amendment, me being able to keep my property and also not having to testify against myself. I also like the 10th Amendment because I don't want the federal government to have 100% overreach over every single locality.
These 12 states. Actually, the 11 largest states gets you to 268 electoral votes, meaning the top 11 state plus any other 12 state you want, even DC, would get you the presidency. It actually makes it easier for these areas to decide the presidential election. Because
over the popular vote? No. Now, you just gave an assertion for how the Electoral College can be used to hijack the country over the popular vote. And you used 12 states, technically 11 of the most populous and then any 12th. The popular vote can do the same thing with just 10 states. You don't need to pick an 11th. ChatGPT to round up the population of the 10 most populous states, which is 178 million. And then the other 40 states is 152 million. I then said if 51% of the most populous states voted red and 49% voted blue, what would that look like? These two numbers and a difference of 3.58 million votes. I said now make the other 40 states vote 51% blue and 49% red. These are the numbers I got, and the difference is 3.04 million votes. This is for blue. So for the 10 most populated states, the majority vote went towards red, the Republican. And for the other 40 states, it went blue for the Democrat. 10 most populated states have a majority, 3.58 million votes more red. And the other 40 states who voted blue have a majority of 3.04 million. Did you look at that? Because there was a Republican victory in the 10 most populous states, it beat out the victory of the Democrats in the other 40 states by 540,000. So the Republicans still won with the popular vote, and that was only 10 states. So no, the popular vote can still hijack the rest of the country, and that's what we don't want. The Electoral College does not make it easier to hijack the election over the popular vote.
the Electoral College doesn't make presidents care about the small states. And if your argument here is that it actually gives more power to people in rural areas.
If I was talking about rural areas, I would have said the word rural areas. I'm in fact talking about small states. Now you can interpret that as small population states. Each of these states have their own local governments, their own state governments, and their own statewide concerns that should not be drowned out by the will of the majority in the higher population zones on the coasts. Regarding your rural arguments for, let's say, Texas and California, I will bet you money that the higher population zones of Texas have more concerns in common with the rural population of the same state than, let's say, Colorado or Wyoming, as we know it, is 23% of the popular vote in order to become the president of the United States.
This is a great argument for why you should abolish the Electoral College. I have no idea why you included it in this video.
But I'll let you know why I included this. I'm not trying to win an argument with my posts. I'm not on trial. My aim is to educate and inform whoever watches my video, even if it takes away from the strength of my arguments. If anyone can supply me with new information that makes me change my mind or at least question my assumptions, I'm happy because I've learned something. There was no electoral college, then presidential elections and their campaigns would just happen here in the Northeast, maybe a little bit around the Chicago area of Illinois, some of Florida, a little bit of Texas, and then California, a little bit of Washington. Everyone else is just SOL.
You just said that they would campaign in more places than they currently do.
We're still stuck on places versus regions. I mentioned the Northeast, Florida, some parts of Texas, a little bit of Illinois, and then the coastal regions on the west. More places does not reflect more regions. And I will keep driving this point home to everyone else's frustration. Everything else on the interior also has to matter in some way, and that is what the Electoral College manages, but not perfectly. That's why it needs to be reformed.
95% of presidential campaigns this season happened in these 7 states. Everyone else was just SO.
I have no idea where you got that 95% metric, and I've looked. I looked for a long time. I'm a very busy guy. I have 3 kids to take care of. I have to generate income. I have a big house that I have to constantly deal with something to fix, and I took time to try to find that 95%. It's nowhere. Maybe you're referring to VoteHub's presidential campaign tracker, which does cover a lot of the swing states, maybe some spots like Texas, California, New York, but they have not been covering every single presidential campaign for the entire duration. So please reveal your source to this special access of information. It is the popular vote that guides where the president and the party puts their priorities.
No, it isn't. That's the whole point. Because of the Electoral College, the president can ignore the popular.
You need to look up the definition of what ignore means. It wasn't just those 7 swing states where billboards, flags, TV commercials, online commercials were used to campaign for both presidential candidates. Then there's the fact, which I mentioned in my next example, that Congress is selected by the popular vote. So is the governor. If a president alienates the popular vote, yet still wins the Electoral College, guess what they might have to deal with? A Congress that's not in the same party as them.
This is one of the best arguments for why we should abolish the Electoral College.
Reform, Yuval. Say it with me. Reform.
Imagine if somebody told you that people who live in cities should have their vote for governor count less than for the people who live in the suburbs. You would think that's stupid. But for some reason, when we apply that same argument to a national level, a lot of you got these kind of political beer goggles. You understand why?
What you just said about people's votes mattering less, apply that to people who live entirely in rural states. That's exactly how they feel compared to states that have major cities in them. So yes, on the gubernatorial and other local levels, cities that have much higher populations have much more of a voice compared to the rural areas of that state. It's a crappy imbalance. On the federal level, with the Electoral College, it's the opposite. And yeah, it sucks sometimes. Does that mean the system should be destroyed or amended? Let's just say there's a resurgence in the birth rates of white conservative Christians. And let's say in a few generations, they become the strongest and most populous demographic in this country. Then the Electoral College is the only thing you have to protect you from their agenda.
This is a weird argument, because what's stopping the Electoral College from doing that right now? That group of people you just described did indeed have power over this country.
Are you saying that it was the white conservative Christians that hijacked the Electoral College and that's why Trump won the 2016 election? Don't disqualify yourself as a reasonable human being like the Trumpers did when they denied the 2020 election. It was Russian and other foreign agents that were trying to steer the popular vote towards Trump in the 2016 election. There's evidence of that, but there is no evidence whatsoever suggesting that the Electoral College was compromised by foreign agents. To suggest that it was white conservative Christians that altered the Electoral College, you might as well be a Trumper that's saying it was illegals, that's why Biden won. Hillary Clinton lost the election because this country still is not ready to have a woman be the president. Our most recent election, November 5th of this year, not only did our country not want to have a white woman as president, they most certainly did not want to have a black woman.
You can make make the argument that majority rule is bad, but I'm telling you, minority rule.
I agree with you, Yuval. Minority rule is worse. And mathematically speaking, it's true. Hillary Clinton did have the majority vote compared to Donald Trump, but we both know practically 48% of the voting population is not a minority. But this wide disparity in the electoral votes does show that we need, like I've been saying throughout this whole presentation, electoral reform. Now, Yuval, I think you meant well. You didn't weigh all the facts. I'm not interested in committing to some kind of bitter tit for tat, so if you're gonna make a response video that's negative, I'm gonna ignore you. If you're as unsatisfied about the election results and the potential consequences as I am, then we shouldn't be bickering against each other. We should be trying to find solutions. My goal for the next 2 years, aside from showing geopolitical content, is to show my viewers and everyone who will watch how our government works, how we can become a part of it, and how we can prevent another disaster. And if anyone watched the entirety of this post, thank you so much for being so patient. I was going to put a lot more in here, but I didn't want this to be like a 45-minute long post. So pardon me for keeping it what I consider to be short. I am the Geo Hussar, and if you're watching on this app, you should click this and then click on this at the very bottom. Thanks for watching.